My name is Kelvin Lee from Nimble, one of 15 manufacturing innovation institutes that make up the Manufacturing USA Network. I have the pleasure of serving as the chair of the Institute Directors Council and will be moderating today's webinar. We'd like to start by mentioning that if you have a question during the webinar, please feel free to enter it into the Q&A box. If there's time, we will take questions at the end. And if we can't get to your question, we do plan to aggregate and post responses at an FAQ at the manufacturingguard.com website. Also, we plan to post a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar at the same website, and we'll share that address with you at the end. The ideas you're going to hear about today reflect the collective thinking of all of the manufacturing innovation institutes that make up the Manufacturing USA Network. Today, however, you'll hear from Chandra Brown from MXD and John Dyke from SESME. By way of background, we'd like to just begin by sharing a little bit of information about the scope and impact of our institutes. Collectively, our 15 institutes, with another one expected to be announced soon, reflect the interests of more than 2,100 member companies, academic institutions, state and local governments, nonprofits, and government agencies. The first Manufacturing Innovation Institute was kicked off in 2012, and today the institutes are funded by one of 3 sponsoring agencies: the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Commerce. In aggregate, the investment reflects more than $1.3 billion of federal funding and an additional $1.5 billion of non-federal co-investment. Our workforce development activities have impacted more than an estimated 670,000 individuals to date. And all of these features and all of these activities are designed with the goal of addressing US competitiveness in advanced manufacturing across different business sectors to meet the needs of our sponsoring agencies. Today, we want to share with you our thoughts and vision of how our country might create a more resilient manufacturing infrastructure to ensure we are prepared for and can effectively respond to crises. The ideas you'll hear presented today came about as the Institute directors started having calls during the early days of the COVID-19 outbreak in the US. Our first COVID-related conference call was actually on March 20th and was initially focused on how we could help each other in our Institute responses to the outbreak by working with our local communities, working with our companies and stakeholders, and trying to address the needs of the nation. Over time, these weekly conversations evolved into a concern about solutions to the readiness and response challenges that have emerged. There have been and continue to be a number of op-ed type publications correctly declaring that our country needs to increase our manufacturing resiliency in the face of a crisis as uncovered by COVID-19. And we certainly agree with that. But we also felt that there were relatively few specific, actionable, yet bold ideas being put forth on how we could rise to that challenge as a nation. So we came up with a few ideas of our own, and that's what we want to share with you. The 4 pillars of our strategy are to create a national manufacturing guard to ensure we have people and resources ready to respond, a national supply chain data exchange to provide infrastructure for real-time supply-demand signals, the technology core to provide public service and manufacturing career opportunities for young Americans, and a resilient manufacturing advisory council to provide advice and input to the federal government. Now, to be clear, these are only our initial thoughts, and we are sharing with the goal of soliciting your feedback and comment. Our institutes are regularly invited to provide information and updates to Congress, and we understand that some of these concepts have been picked up at that level, and we're really quite excited about that. Now, these 4 pillars are being proposed with the goal of developing a resilient, agile, secure manufacturing base necessary to support our economic and national security. The activities will span industry sectors and will involve public and private stakeholders. They will create a supply chain efficiency during normal times and offer critical infrastructure to power supply chains during crisis response, while also offering young Americans from all backgrounds opportunities to gain advanced manufacturing skills. And for clarity, the crisis today is a pandemic. But in the future, the crisis could be a result of weather or climate, of an earthquake, of armed conflict, of social unrest. There are many reasons for the need to ensure a more resilient manufacturing infrastructure to secure our country. And so to start, I'm going to turn the floor over to Chanja Brown from MXD to describe the vision for the National Manufacturing Guard.
Thank you, Kelvin, for those very wonderful introductory remarks. And I also want to welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I know we have, I think, over 200 people tuning in today to hear about these ideas. So we're very excited to get your feedback. As Kelvin said, we have 4 proposed pillars, and I have the first one, the manufacturing guard. Let's talk about what this means. Manufacturers, I think as we all know, by their very nature are doers, and their natural response in times of crisis are to manufacture, to do, and to make. And the idea of this National Manufacturing Guard was inspired by that really proactive nature. So we frame the National Manufacturing Guard as a reserve of industry volunteers who are trained and empowered to, in times of crises, help manage manufacturing supply chains, logistic infrastructure, and workforce resources. I think this goes without saying that agile realignment of supply chains, particularly in a crisis, is definitely not an easy task. We've seen that throughout this pandemic. Readiness planning and training for this eventuality will make an enormous difference. We also like to make the analogy to the National Guard's readiness to defend our country to propose the idea of the National Manufacturing Guard. So think of the group that's envisioned to be made up of leading subject matter experts in manufacturing and production, where participants can volunteer for service individually or be nominated by their organizations. Companies from all industry sectors would be incentivized to engage. This could be via tax or other economic and policy mechanisms yet to be decided. This would be great for retired expert veterans and anyone who really cares about the future of manufacturing in the United States. This will be guided by the Resilient Manufacturing Advisory Council, which I am going to address later in this presentation. And this body of experts is going to be tasked to understand critical supply chain gaps and develop system-level plans, both nationally and regionally, to address issues including policy frameworks and technology needs. Members of this National Manufacturing Guard would assemble and train periodically for agile and effective response during a crisis, to mitigate the scenarios that could threaten our supply chains and impede immediate availability and access to necessary products across the country or within a region as dictated by any state's needs. So to perform this mission, the Manufacturing Guard members are going to use the National Supply Chain Data Exchange infrastructure, and they're going to mentor and network with Technology Corps volunteers. And those are the 2 pillars you're going to hear about next. So you'll be able to see how all 4 of these pillars tie together. Through the National Manufacturing Guard training and engagement, these participants will be our nation's experts in resilient supply chains and poised to help our nation speedily deploy both the material and the human resources we need when faced with a crisis. Next slide, please. So what are the next steps? We're pretty practical people here. We know there's a lot of work to be done. So this is just step 1, as Kelvin said. We're collecting your feedback, your ideas. We want to talk to stakeholders, anyone who's interested in this, specifically on your thoughts towards defining the details of this manufacturing guard. Some areas, as you can see on the screen, we have lots to talk about, from the command and control authorities, who runs this at a state and federal level, who and what is the national entity responsible for executing this mission, all about the operations, the recruitment process, and also incentives. What would work to encourage healthy and appropriate company and individual participation? So we look forward to your input. And with that, I am going to pass on to my very good friend, John, who I want everyone to know dressed up for the occasion today. And he is going to talk about the next two pillars, the National Supply Chain Data Exchange and the Technology Corp. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Chandra. And to everyone attending today, we sincerely appreciate your interest in the ideas we're putting forward here. As Calvin mentioned at the beginning of the session, there are a couple of elements relating to the manufacturing supply chain, particularly around one, developing a secure supply chain backbone powered by real-time supply data from manufacturing operations and demand signals, and two, being able to provide visibility into and then analyze that data to create actionable responses and strategies at both a local and national level, so that looking forward, we'll be much better positioned to respond to disruptions during crises. And ultimately, that's what the National Supply Chain Data Exchange is all about. It became clear early in this pandemic that the dramatic disruption of both supply and demand would have a substantial impact on our ability to meet both the immediate needs of the healthcare providers as well as consumers across the country. It was equally clear that the existing supply chain visibility and response solutions were inadequate for a disruption on this scale. Many have written about and tried to document these failures, but given the magnitude of the challenge, it's clear that a thoughtful, well-orchestrated national strategy is essential for us to ensure that we emerge from this experience with a truly resilient supply chain and manufacturing base. There are plenty of supply chain exchanges that enable commerce and transactions using contemporary technologies, but the urgent need for immediate, accurate data about suppliers' manufacturing operations in the face of disruption is not readily accessible. The remarkable reality for most manufacturers is that the tools they still use to collaborate with their suppliers are largely unchanged in the past 20, 30 years. The vast majority of supplier communications happens, believe it or not, via faxes, phone calls, and email. Responding with agility when demand rises or falls precipitously, as it did, requires immediate and precise responses to countless urgent questions. We need to immediately be able to answer questions about available capacity right now, the status and health and quality parameters of existing goods being produced right now, the status of orders that can either be quickly retracted or accelerated, the status of all relevant inventory and work in progress right now, what's available in the warehouse or distribution center so we can make intelligent substitutions for the right SKUs. These are remarkably difficult to answer in real time. And if the manufacturers can't find the answers, except by brute force, there's no way they can respond to emergency orders in a timely manner. Clearly, this needs to be addressed. The fact that it hasn't been addressed yet, I think, speaks to the inherent complexities, the lack of standards, accessibility of low-cost, ubiquitous technology, and the lack of policies and support for this type of initiative. This is the challenge we propose to tackle. We will invest in proof of concepts that will serve to demonstrate the feasibility of a secure, trusted, end-to-end national supply chain data backbone. This will provide automated mechanisms for suppliers, many of which are small and medium manufacturers that don't have access to sophisticated supply chain tools, to provide their manufacturing customers with a pre-structured data set from their manufacturing operations in real time and without the need of any human involvement. This initiative would also involve the creation of a specific set of supply chain visibility and resiliency tools, key performance indicators designed to leverage this new flow of real-time data. Combining these modeling and simulation capabilities with other risk mitigation and analytics would give participants among various value chains the chance to flexibly respond to crises, natural disasters, outages, or even normal but unforeseen shifts in supply and demand. We also envision building response playbooks with the knowledge gained from understanding and modeling the real supply chain disruptions. The playbooks would offer standardized responses for operations under normal and crisis situations and would provide guidance to manufacturers on how to assess and predict resilience. and how to respond when the unexpected happens. The playbook will also provide the methodologies for small and medium-sized companies to engage in this digital transformation required for supply chain resilience. Ultimately, this work will engage suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors of all sizes and can begin almost immediately with the analysis of what has gone well or poorly over the last half year of COVID response. Next slide, Kelvin. Much like what Chandra described for the manufacturing guard, we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done to put the supply chain data exchange into operation, particularly on a national scale. From a policy perspective, we need to facilitate the creation of an operating structure and decision-making authority trusted by manufacturers, big and small. And we also need to ensure that the incentive, the value, is there to ensure that organizations participate and contribute data. We envision that a separate, trusted organization will be required to facilitate the creation of the necessary technologies, like the supply chain backbone and tools, work to effectively anonymize any data that's to be shared, and maintain the exchange. This group will also need to develop standards for how data is requested and exchanged, develop standard KPIs to measure supply chain resiliency and others, standardized methods for making data anonymous, and a clear plan to ensure that the exchange is secure. The proof of concept we envision will demonstrate all of these capabilities. Next slide, Kelvin, please. In his opening remarks, Kelvin also alluded to our goals related to workforce development, such as developing career pathways for diverse domestic talent, giving them opportunities to engage in high-value jobs and national service opportunities, and identifying opportunities for those individuals, and particularly those from underserved communities, to gain access to and experience in advanced manufacturing jobs. This is absolutely essential. Those are among the objectives of what we've called out here as the technology core. We envision the core to be modeled after other service-oriented programs like the Peace Corps or Teach for America, but in this case, focused on STEM and with a manufacturing orientation. The program will identify and organize a diverse talent pool of young Americans aged 18 to 24, offer them an opportunity for national service in industry or perhaps even in partnership with our manufacturing institutes. It'll give those students an opportunity to be introduced to cutting-edge topics in science, in engineering, and manufacturing. These could range from mechanics to robotics and smart manufacturing technologies, things like materials, chemicals, and biology, or even advanced computing, machine learning, and data science. One might envision, for example, that a high school graduate intending to go to college could participate in this program during a gap year. Perhaps a graduating high school senior doesn't yet know whether college is the answer. Perhaps he or she is considering going directly to work or into military service. Ultimately, the Technology Corps would offer either of these candidates the chance to get real-world, practical experience in a manufacturing setting, and would almost certainly either go to college or the military or the workplace with a much more informed, practical view of how industry works, how things are made, and perhaps even how commerce happens in the US. We want the Technology Corps to be as inclusive as possible and will encourage the recruiting of talent from a diverse pool across all communities in the US. In the best case, many participants in the Corps would decide to pursue careers related to manufacturing, helping all of us build the talent pipeline that we so clearly need to drive next generation manufacturing in the years to come. Next slide, please, Kelvin. Just like with the manufacturing guard and the data exchange, work is needed to define the policy and operations efforts with respect to the Technology Corps. The operations entity will need to engage a diverse set of stakeholders, including groups such as the member associations listed here, along with our manufacturing USA institutes and others, to ensure that they cast the widest net possible to reach prospective candidates for the Corps. Ultimately, they'll need to build the most effective experiential learning programs, which we imagine will include internships, on-the-job training, apprenticeships, and so on. One might also envision opportunities for industry or institute subject matter experts to weigh in on educational content development, to prioritize the skills needed by participants, and reflect what industry and potentially even to act as mentors or hosts for those participants. It's an exciting opportunity that we would like to see move forward in the days to come. With that, I'm happy to hand the floor back to you, Chandra, so that you can share your perspective on the Resilient Manufacturing Advisory Council.
Thank you, John. Okay, everyone, we're on our final pillar. We're going to talk about what's the overarching tie together of these plans. So to continue the role of the supply chain task force, this is what we're forming now to help get the details on all this. Obviously, we know we're going to need a more permanent Resilient Manufacturing Advisory Council. So they are going to manage the overarching execution of these processes moving forward. So again, this body, of course, will be comprised of diverse and representative stakeholders from industry, from government, this includes federal and state, academia that are leading subject matter experts in supply chain, manufacturing technologies, best practices. It'll be geographically diverse across this country. It will also supply the federal government and bring all this together with recommendations on strategies and how to best execute the missions and improve the efficacy of the manufacturing guard, the data exchange, and the technology core. So at this high level, this advisory council would periodically assess the mapping of existing supply networks to understand the critical gaps in US manufacturing capabilities and infrastructure. They would identify critical feedstock limitations, things like policy frameworks, material and process development needs, and opportunities to refine current and design new technologies for optimized system design. And really overall to coordinate and help manage the work to build a more resilient and flexible manufacturing infrastructure in the United States. Next slide, please. So again, we'd like to have our practical, what are the next steps for those of you that are interested in this advisory council? Again, lots of issues to address, lots of details still to come to formulate to this vision. What we want to do is have this manufacturing task force, and they will convene private and public sector stakeholders, probably with some of the folks listening on today, and to gather input and frame recommendations for the 4 pillars of this program. Next slide, please. Here comes the big one. This is a basic chart, well, kind of a detailed basic chart to capture all these interdependencies we've been talking about today. It has the core National Manufacturing Guard framework, and it has the 4 pillars, and all the stakeholders who could be participating and providing input. I want to be very clear, this is by no means exhaustive. We welcome much more information on who else should be involved moving forward. This Resilient Manufacturing Council, as we said, will translate industry, academia needs into recommendations for the operating authority with its government insight. And the key stakeholders will be, again, industry, all sectors, all sizes of manufacturers, big and small, trade groups. Could also include things like academia and workforce development, Manufacturing USA Institutes, Manufacturing Extension Partnership. But collectively, this group is going to provide advice and counsel and support the work within the entirety of this resilient manufacturing operational entity. So I hope this all makes sense to everyone. We really appreciate your time. And I would like to hand it back over to Kelvin, who is going to take us through the concluding part.
Thank you, Tim. So in conclusion, we do want to remind you that we're sharing these as an initial set of thoughts, and we are certainly inviting comments and feedback. We believe that these are bold ideas, but actionable. And the dialogue, the discussion, and the debate that we hope these ideas will stimulate are going to be an important part of finding the right path forward. And we certainly feel a sense of urgency on this topic. Because as COVID-19 has highlighted, it's really critical for any nation, for our nation, to ensure that we have a resilient, agile manufacturing supply chain to promote our national security and way of life. And the framework of public-private partnerships could be leveraged to establish these types of programs. And we know that realizing these ideas will certainly require new authorities, new programs, new investment, and a collaborative approach between the public and the private sectors. We're certainly available and interested to be a part of that conversation, but it is a conversation that requires many additional stakeholders. Now, I want to remind you before I go to this final slide that if you have a question, you should please feel free to enter that into the Q&A box, and we do have a number, and we will try to end at 2:30, but we'll have time for maybe one question. But before we get there, I do want to thank you for your time. We invite you to visit MFG Guard, or you could type in manufacturingguard.com to get more information. We certainly are interested in your input and ideas. You can also share your ideas by just emailing us directly at info@mfgguard.com. As a reminder, a copy of these slides, an FAQ, and a recording will be available at the website in the coming days. And finally, I do want to thank the communications teams from all of the institutes, and especially from MXD and from SESME, for helping to organize and arrange today's meeting. So I'm going to look at the clock now. We've got just a couple of minutes. We'll try to take a question or two. And I think maybe the first question, I'll just go to the supply chain question. So maybe this is for John. Why would companies share proprietary supply chain information with other organizations and the government?
Thanks, Calvin. Probably the single most important question on the tip of anyone's tongue that's hearing this deserves a long response, but I'll keep it brief just to say that as I mentioned earlier, this entire initiative is premised on the idea that there's value for both the data producers and consumers on the supply chain backbone. It's also important to note that each participant has full control over what they share with their suppliers or their customers. There will also be opportunities to share anonymized data with the appropriate authorities where appropriate, but even that is completely gated by the original producers of that data. And last, I'll just comment on the fact that both trust and cybersecurity are important, are uber important, and participants need to feel comfortable that any information they share is protected. I'll leave it at that for the time being.
Thanks. I'm going to try to squeeze one more in. Maybe for Chandra. So there's a question about, can you explain a little bit more about the manufacturing guard? Are there any examples of how it would actually work?
See why I go last, because I'm the fastest talker. Okay, I'm ready. I can answer this question in 1 minute. I like practical examples. Let's take face masks, everyone's favorite problem during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, we all know this, big shortage, critical personnel, protective equipment, PPE, missing across the country. Something like a manufacturing national guard would provide this existing network already stood up of partners. They can help understand the supply and demand dynamics, what are the production capacities in different parts of the country, and help provide a more streamlined approach to meeting the needs of our first responders and communities. And we know we need to do this in conjunction with the national government, right? But we think industry has a lot of expertise and input that we could make this much more seamless and improved from where it is today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So with that, we're at time. We do have a number of questions we couldn't get to, but we will aggregate those and post an FAQ. Again, feel free to send us additional thoughts and perspective at the email address, and you can certainly stay tuned to our website to get more information. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of your day.